The Roman Senate refused Carthallo entry into the city. What is more, they even refused to speak to the delegation of Roman soldiers. There would be no ransom. To so publicly doom the lives of 8,000 of your own troops in captivity was a show of determination that defied convention. Even the clever Hannibal must have been surprised by Rome's refusal to negotiate. Still, the Carthaginian general was in a position of strength, and his army remained unchallenged in Italy. It was reasonable to think that sustained pressure would eventually force the Romans to concede defeat, and now he was marching towards Campania to accept the defection of Capua, a city second only to Rome in size and importance on the Italian peninsula. The powerful city wanted to secure its own regional supremacy for some time. Now they used Hannibal's growing presence in Italy as leverage to demand from Rome that one of the two consuls should always be selected from Capua. When their Roman allies refused, the Capuans had the pretext they needed to open the gates. Hannibal left a garrison to set up winter quarters in the city and resumed operations in Campania. Observing from Casilinum, Marcellus did not seek battle in the open and instead chose to shadow the Carthaginians. Although the Roman general did not realize it yet, Hannibal wanted to draw him and his army away from Casilinum, which threatened Capua's northern flank. The Carthaginian general stopped at Neapolis, recognizing the importance of its port, which could offer a safe haven for ships carrying reinforcements and supplies from Africa. However, the city's garrison was commanded by a Roman mayor and unlikely to defect. Since besieging a fortified coastal city without naval support was futile, the Carthaginian general did not waste any time. He turned his attention to Nuceria Alfraterna, one of the largest and oldest cities in ancient Campania, built in the 6th century BC, with Oscan, Etruscan, Samnite, and Roman heritage. The city was a hegemon of the Nucerian League, a Samnite alliance that included the cities of Pompeii, Stabia, and Herculaneum. Persuading the League to defect would further strengthen Hannibal's position in Italy. Once in front of the city, the gates remained closed. Met with impregnable double-curtain walls, Hannibal's only option was to surround the city. He threatened to subdue Nuceria by starvation. But, in light of his success at Capua, he had hoped that his propaganda image of wanting to liberate and respect the independence of the Italian peoples would convince Nuceria's Senate to switch sides. But Nuceria remained a loyal ally of Rome. To combat the food shortage, the city officials expelled those who were unable to carry a weapon and fight. Nucerians gambled that Hannibal would not risk tarnishing his image by refusing to shelter the refugees. The Carthaginian general understood their plan. Not for the first time, he would demonstrate his ruthlessness and cunning. Instead of accepting those expelled from the city, he mixed them with refugees from several surrounding settlements and forced them back inside the walls. In an instant, Nuceria's population doubled, the food stock quickly ran out, and the suffering began. Without hope of any help from the Romans, the Nucerian Senate opened negotiations. Hannibal gave safe passage to all inhabitants, who took shelter in nearby towns, then allowed his troops to plunder. Before leaving, the Carthaginians methodically leveled the city to the ground. After the destruction of Nuceria, Hannibal turned his army towards Nola, a key Campanian city, due to rumors that the inhabitants were on the verge of revolting against Rome. Marcellus reached the city just in time and braced for the arrival of the Carthaginian general. Both commanders deployed in battle formation. Marcellus arrayed his men with the walls and gates behind them. Hannibal launched a probing attack, hoping that the inhabitants will rise once they heard that battle has commenced. Indeed, during the skirmish, a few panicked senators came outside to warn that the situation in the city was unstable. Marcellus was careful not to commit his men, and as soon as the skirmish ended, he withdrew behind the walls. Senators of Nola, firmly in favor of keeping the alliance with Rome, now explained that the people were in favor of Hannibal, in part out of fear that he would devastate their fields around the city and cause a famine. Furthermore, it was uncovered that there had been nocturnal talks between the inhabitants and the Carthaginians. It was agreed that once the Romans again deployed outside the walls, Hannibal would launch an attack, while the people inside would seize Marcellus's supplies and weapons, close the gates, and take up position on the walls, thereby trapping the Romans. Marcellus thanked the senators for informing him. Before the city could revolt, the Roman general divided his army into three. Each contingent was ordered to deploy in complete silence behind the three gates facing the enemy. The baggage train was told to stay close to the army. His best infantry and the Roman cavalry were to deploy behind the central gate. To guard the side and rear doors, he redeployed the recruits and velites from the walls and towers and added the allied cavalry. In addition, Marcellus forbade the inhabitants from approaching the walls and gates, and the Roman headquarters in the center of the city was strengthened. After a long wait, it seemed strange to Hannibal that the Romans did not deploy in front of the central gate, and that there were no troops manning the walls. Suspecting that his secret talks with the people of Nola were uncovered, he advanced forward. The plan was to attack the central gate, as Hannibal was convinced that the Nolans would rise once battle commenced. As the Carthaginians moved in a loose formation, the Roman trumpets sounded off. A loud clamor arose as Marcellus's men came rushing out of the three gates. The Romans forewent forming in battle formation and instead pressed forward. What the maneuver lacked in sophistication, it made up for with surprise. At first, the Carthaginian center was in trouble, unable to react to the rapid attack, but Hannibal was soon able to stabilize the line. Meanwhile, the advance of the Roman wings fell upon the Carthaginian left and right. Then came a large cloud of dust raised by Marcellus's advancing baggage train, leading the Carthaginians to believe that the Roman army was much larger than it actually was. Recognizing that Marcellus had the initiative, Hannibal ordered the men to disengage. He knew that the ruse with the baggage train could cause panic among his ranks, and did not want to let his opponent capitalize on it. The Romans dared not pursue, and the Carthaginians withdrew in good order. Hannibal was most certainly surprised by Marcellus's capabilities as a general. He didn't just shadow the Carthaginian army, but could judge when was the perfect moment to challenge them in battle. In a sense, Marcellus employed an aggressive version of the Fabian strategy. Although the attack on Nola was repulsed, Hannibal successfully drew Marcellus away from the Volturnus river. He now doubled back, taking Acera after a short siege, and proceeded to Casilinum, where Marcellus left a garrison. The town controlled a triple archway bridge across the river Volturnus, on the main road that connected Capua to Rome. As one of the very few crossings across the formidable river, it was of crucial strategic value. After about a month, the Roman garrison was starved into submission. they paid an enormous sum for safe passage. By capturing Casilinum, Hannibal secured Capua's northern flank and now held a vital point from where he could launch attacks towards Rome. A garrison was left to guard the town, while the rest of the army returned to winter quarters in Capua. Hannibal formally handed control over Casilinum to the Capuans and began making plans for the coming months. Back at Nola, Marcellus closed the gates and posted sentries to prevent anyone from leaving the city. Those that conspired with Hannibal were put on trial and beheaded. The Roman general then marched out and encamped on the heights overlooking Suessula, keeping a close eye on the Carthaginians. While the stalemate at Nola was unimportant in the strategic sense, Marcellus's encounter with Hannibal was significant because it was the first time the Romans avoided defeat in a battle against the Carthaginian. And the two generals would meet again. By the autumn period of 216 BC, Hannibal was consolidating his power base in southern Italy. His main army at Capua stood at around 40,000 men, including additions from his Samnite allies. His brother Mago, now on his way south with 1,200 Numidians, would recruit an additional 17,000 Lucanians and Bruttians, and bring his own force up to over 18,000 troops. Opposing them, Rome scrambled to raise new legions over the coming months. An impressive 80,000 troops would be put to field in Italy, with the majority concentrated in the south. But despite the Roman numerical strength exceeding that of their enemy, many of these were inexperienced recruits who felt abject terror at the thought of meeting Hannibal in battle. Worse, in some of the settlements of central Italy, the number of Roman and allied fighting men began to dwindle, which was a testament to the blood toll exacted on them by Hannibal's tactical superiority and his wealth of ideas on the battlefield. Fabius Maximus, the father of the Fabian strategy, would again be elected consul for the next 2 years. He would revert to avoiding conflict with the Carthaginian general to preserve the troops and give Rome's manpower time to recover. But while the war was thus far mostly dominated by the campaign of Hannibal in Italy, as the year 215 rolled around, the Second Punic War would spread across the Mediterranean. While Hannibal worked to add to his list of allies, his other objective was reinforcements. His brother Mago advanced south and besieged Petelia. Together with Consentia, these two cities were among the most prominent in Bruttium, boasting a developed infrastructure, imposing walls, and a bustling city culture. In its quest to establish dominion over Italy, Rome favored the urban centers of Bruttium and had long been replacing their local ruling elite with the pro-Roman aristocracy. In turn, the pro-Roman factions of Petelia and Consentia treated the less urbanized communities in the region with disdain, which created a rift among Bruttians. Needless to say, these internal divisions suited Rome as they made the region easier to control. But Mago now used this hostile factionalism to his advantage. He circulated news that Petelia was besieged, prompting thousands of Bruttians who were angry at the city for siding with Rome to join Hannibal. With his work in Bruttium complete, Mago left Hanno the Elder in charge of the army and embarked for Carthage to seek support for the campaign in Italy. By this stage, neither side was the undisputed master of the sea. While Rome had overall superiority, the Carthaginian navy had significantly recovered from the setback earlier in the war. Both could patrol far into enemy waters and raid coastal towns, but lacked the strength to rule the waves of the western Mediterranean. But with most of Bruttium now under Hannibal's control, there was less risk for transporting troops from Africa to Italy. And with this, Mago disembarked in Carthage. Murmurs reverberated in the packed Senate hall. In attendance, all of Carthage's notables anxiously waited. Then Mago rose to speak, presenting before the Senate the progress of the campaign in Italy. Colleagues, countrymen, since crossing the Alps, Hannibal had won several victories, including 3 great pitched battles against Rome's main armies, 2 of which were completely destroyed and their camps looted. And now the Romans avoid fighting us altogether out of fear. 200,000 Roman fighting men are slain and 50,000 prisoners are taken. Italy is in a state of revolt, and the south had gone over to Hannibal. With a single army, Hannibal had achieved all of this against several Roman armies. Mago then turned away from the map to present to the Senate a bag filled with hundreds of golden rings belonging to the Roman aristocracy that fell at Cannae. He asked for funds and additional armies to be sent to Italy. With another 20 to 30,000 troops at his disposal, Hannibal would break Rome. Mago's presentation suggested that with the 18,000-strong army that he himself had recruited, consistent pressure could be applied in Bruttium until the last of the cities loyal to Rome either came to Hannibal's side or were taken by force. Another army of 20,000 from Carthage could take and hold Apulia and its vital ports, thereby cutting Rome's ability to contest the waters of the Ionian Sea. This would open lines of communication between Hannibal and a likely ally, Philip V of Macedon, enabling uninterrupted transport of ships, provisions, and troops. Finally, stationed in Campania with his main host, Hannibal would have complete control over southern Italy. With 3 armies in close proximity, capable of quickly combining their forces, as well as controlling their respective areas individually, Carthaginian authority over local communities and cities would be absolute. As such, Hannibal could fully exploit southern Italy's manpower and resources to beat the Romans at their own game, the war of attrition, and could use his tactical brilliance to dominate the Romans on the battlefield. Hearing Mago's report, most of the Senate rejoiced. But, as fortunes of war would have it, Hannibal's worst enemies were not in Rome, but in Carthage. When Hanno II stood up to speak, a heavy silence fell upon the room. He was an immensely powerful aristocrat and a veteran commander, albeit not a very competent one. Most of his wealth and political power was derived from his stake in the silver mines of Iberia and the heavy taxation he imposed on African tribes that lived on the vast expanses of land which he owned. As such, in the Senate he represented the interests of the wealthy, for whom it was profitable to sue for peace with Rome, even with unfavorable terms for Carthage, because a peace agreement would enable Hanno and his supporters to assume their maritime commercial operations. In addition, their interests in rare metals is the reason why Hanno favored redirecting reinforcements to protect Iberia, and why he preferred territorial expansion not into Italy, but into Africa, where he and his powerful friends stood to profit from expanding their already endless tracts of taxable land. These discrepancies between the interests of the super-wealthy and the war effort of Carthage was what made Hanno the leading opponent of the Barca family and their war of conquest in Italy. He addressed Mago. "You say the armies of the enemy are slain, yet you ask for more soldiers. You say the enemy camps are looted, yet you ask for corn and funds. I wonder, if you ask for all of this help, Is Hannibal truthful about his victories? If he is, then I say he doesn't need help from us, and if he is not, then he doesn't deserve it." At hearing this, senators from the docks behind Hanno cheered him on. He continued, "You say, Margo, that Roman power is annihilated and that Italy is in a state of revolt. I ask you then, has a single Roman or any of the 35 tribes come to our side?" "No, they have not," Margo replied. Hanno went on, "Then there are still too many Romans left. Do you know then, Margo, is the enemy's will to fight broken? Have they approached Hannibal for peace?" "I do not know," Margo answered, a truthful answer, given that he parted ways with Hannibal soon after the Battle of Cannae, and was unaware if any negotiations with Rome were taking place. "Well then," Hanno concluded, "with many Romans still in the fight and no treating of peace, you have made no progress since the start of the war. I say, if Hannibal's victories are true, he should seek terms with Rome, and not ask for help from Carthage. For if he cannot obtain peace after his supposed victories, what terms will he be able to obtain if his fortunes against the Romans change? It seems to me that we are not discussing peace, but only talking about helping the agenda of one man, Hannibal." Hanno clearly showed in this senatorial meeting why he was one of the most capable orators of his time. But as clever as he was in discrediting Hannibal, the supporters of the Barcids were outraged, and they had every reason to be. Hanno insisted that Carthage must negotiate with Rome, that peace was necessary, thereby implying that Carthage should not and cannot risk the consequences of losing the war, but must make peace now, while the going is good. If this fear of defeat ever reached the enemy, for the Romans it would be like smelling blood. Despite their setbacks against Hannibal, with such division among Carthage's top officials, the Romans would know that they had already won the war. So it's needless to say that Hanno's dissemination of this dangerous rhetoric directly undermined Carthage's war effort and perhaps its future as an imperial power. As Hannibal once said to his men, "War is won by those who are ready to conquer or die," and Rome had already shown its readiness to conquer or perish. Carthage, having chosen to walk the path of empire for 600 years, had to show that same resolve if it was to be victorious and retain its imperial status. Hannibal's supporters further argued that, as the only man who showed consistent success in command, deep in enemy territory no less, he must be supported, even if Iberia was lost. In their view, to conquer a peace agreement at the gates of Rome meant that the withdrawal of Roman troops from Iberia could be demanded as a condition during negotiations, and Carthaginian dominance over the western Mediterranean could be restored. Amidst this ongoing political turmoil in Carthage, the majority of the Senate was nevertheless impressed enough with Margo's report to vote in favor of sending him back to Italy with an army and funds to aid Hannibal. A host of 12,000 African infantry, up to 6,000 Numidian cavalry, and around 40 elephants were to be assembled. But Hanno's political tentacles reached across the empire, and he would severely slow down the recruitment of Hannibal's reinforcements at every turn, prolonging the process for around 6 months. Then, as the latter days of autumn brought with them the scent of the stinging coldness that was just around the corner, a message arrived from Sardinia. It was from Hampsicora of Cornus, a Sardo-Punic political leader and one of the richest landowners of Sardinia. Much of the island was still dominated by the Punic elite, especially along the western and southern coasts, which were part of the Carthaginian Empire for over 250 years, until Sardinia came under Roman control just 20 years ago, in 237 BC. This resulted in a strained relationship between the Romans and Sardinia's ruling class and its population. Occasional clashes flared up, but the legions were largely able to keep the peace and exploit the island's rich resources of grain, salt, wine, and olives, as well as several big mining operations of gold and silver, a valuable source for minting new currency, and lead, which was used in various fields of civil life, from crockery to water pipes. But most importantly, Sardinia was a vital point for controlling access to Roman waters and could serve to intercept Carthaginian shipping to the south. However, the situation was now ripe for revolt. The ambassadors that carried the message pleaded for help, and the Carthaginian Senate made a decision to mobilize another army of 12,000 infantry and 1,500 horse to be sent to Sardinia under the command of Hasdrubal the Bald. Meanwhile, on the rest of Ireland, Hampsicora was joined by Hanno of Tharos. Their combined force motivated more cities to rise up, and some of the inland tribes pledged their support as well. Rebellion in Sardinia had begun. News of the unrest had reached Praetor Quintus Mucius Scaevola, a member of the ancient and noble patrician family. He immediately sent word back to Rome, asking for help. The Roman legion under his command was under strength due to sickness that he too suffered from and was unable to perform his duties. Provisions and payments for the troops were irregular amidst the chaos of the war, which only made the situation worse. Upon receiving his message, the Roman Senate hurriedly sent Titus Manlius Torquatus with a small contingent and provisions to patch up the legion in Sardinia. Titus was a distinguished Roman politician, twice a consul in 235 and 224 BC, and a member of the Manlia family, one of the most important patrician families of the Republic. Once he disembarked at Cagliari, Titus temporarily assumed command, bringing news that more reinforcements would come next spring. But upon learning of the activities of the rebels, he realized that he would not be able to hold out through the winter. The legion was still under strength and in poor health. Worse, once the Sardo-Punic army fully mobilized, they would outnumber the Romans at least 2-1, and this ratio would rise to 4-1 if the Carthaginians managed to reach the island before winter. Something needed to be done now, so Titus took provisions to last a few days and gathered no more than 6,000 men that were fit to march towards Cornus. Meanwhile, Hampsicora journeyed into the Sardinian interior to recruit troops from the tribes that declared their support for the uprising. He left his son Hiostus in charge of the 10,000-strong army and the collection of provisions until he returned. But Titus was closing in fast. On approach, the numerical advantage of the Sardo-Punic army was clear. Tucked in between the sea to the west and the hills to the east, they held a strong position with the walls of Cornus behind them. But Titus observed that the enemy was not in full battle order and that no archers were manning the walls. It appeared as if they were not expecting a battle. He ordered the Roman line forward. All too aware of the poor physical condition of his men, Titus slowed the advance to a crawl, making it easier for his tired troops to maintain their formation. He had hoped that by closing the distance he would unnerve the enemy and force them into committing themselves forward. If the Sardo-Punic troops broke formation to charge, this would give the compact Roman legion a chance. But Hiostus's orders were not to attack. Titus gradually halted his advance a mere stone's throw away from the opponent, yet they wouldn't move. Understanding that it would be impossible to dislodge a more numerous and better rested army from their defensive position, the Roman general resorted to harsh language. He berated Hiostus, questioning his bravery and his manhood. Some of the centurions joined in with their own insults. The laughter of the Roman troops could be heard inside the city. The young Sardo-Punic aristocrat was fuming. After a few minutes of this verbal barrage, he could take no more. With their pride bruised, Eostus's men attacked with zest. The weary Roman line bore the initial brunt of the charge with some difficulty, but they held their nerve, encouraged by experienced centurions to stay compact behind their shields until the enemy ran out of steam. Titus then gave the signal. The formation of the less disciplined Sardo-Punic troops quickly began to crumble against the advance of the veteran legionaries. Step by step, the Roman line trod forward, jabbing at the enemy from behind the wall of shields. It soon became clear that Eostus's rash attack for the sake of saving face in front of his men was a bad decision. By attacking the Roman line, he abandoned his strong defensive position and trapped his own army between the enemy, the hills and the sea, and the walls of the city. Unable to escape, 5,700 Sardo-Punic troops, some 60% of his army, were cut down, but the exhausted Romans could fight no more and had begun taking losses as well. Seeing that his men are at their limit, Titus pulled back. The Roman victory at Cornus did not succeed in destroying one Sardo-Punic army before another one could be assembled, but it gave Titus some time to prepare for the next encounter. Many of his men died on the way back due to exhaustion and sickness, but Titus's swift action killed off some of the best troops that the rebel cities could levy and had put a dent in the morale of the Sardo-Punic army. Whatever troops Hampsicora recruited from the other cities and tribes further inland, he would now likely be more inclined to wait for the Carthaginian army to come to his aid than to take on the Romans himself. For now, the Roman army in Sardinia held on. Having received orders from Carthage to lead his army overland at the earliest opportunity and join his brother Hannibal in Italy, Hasdrubal Barca continued his preparations after crushing the Tartessi rebellion earlier in the year. But, in a detailed report sent to the Senate, he insisted they send him a successor with a strong army to guard Carthaginian possessions in the Iberian Peninsula. Hasdrubal asserted that, even if all should go well, his successor in Iberia would not find it to be a peaceful province. This advice left a deep impression and received widespread support in the Carthaginian Senate. Throughout September and October, Himilco was put in charge of assembling an army of at least 20,000, along with an augmented fleet, and tasked with defending Iberia both by sea and land. Hasdrubal's assertions were not without merit. The stockpiling of provisions and the collection of tribute from the subjugated population to finance the upcoming campaign stirred up rumors that the Carthaginian army was leaving, which was enough to fan unrest among the locals. There was real danger that once Hasdrubal marched off to Italy, many of the tribes would either revolt or join the Romans. Himilco arrived in late autumn 216 BC, signaling the start of the campaign to drive the Scipio brothers out of Iberia. By the time Hasdrubal received his reinforcements in Iberia, the third winter of the war had set in, and the fighting in all theaters had subsided. But trouble was brewing in Sicily. The Greek cities across the north and northeast of the island broke away, seeing their chance to gain independence from Rome. Then, at the turn of the year, the elderly tyrant of Syracuse, Hieron II, had died. For 50 years he was a loyal ally of Rome, but now the crown passed to his 15-year-old grandson, Hieronymus. Hannibal's successes in Italy convinced the young ruler to open negotiations on how to divide Sicily. Two envoys of Carthaginian Syracusan descent, Hippocrates and Epicides, came to Hieronymus, promising that the whole of Sicily will be a Syracusan possession. Internal political conflict raged for another 3 months, but the pro-Carthaginian faction eventually prevailed. Hieronymus joined Hannibal's side with an army of 15,000 and another 4,000 under the leadership of Hippocrates and Epicides. In addition, Carthaginian ships in the area were joined by the Syracusan fleet. Syracuse now threatened to tip the balance of the war. Rome was rapidly losing control over Sicily. The island was a springboard for raids against the African coast. Furthermore, it served as a shield for Italy proper. Conversely, Carthage could now use the ports of Sicily to launch raids against Roman cities and more safely transport troops to southern Italy. The reinforcements that Hannibal was expecting could give him the resources for a finishing blow. And with some of the best Roman troops now at risk of being cut off, 2 of Appius Claudius's legions were withdrawn from Sicily back to mainland Italy, while the disgraced survivors of Cannae went the other way. Additional ships were sent to protect Sicily against a possible Carthaginian invasion, while the remaining squadrons patrolled Italy's coastal waters. It was then, near Brundisium, that a Macedonian ship was intercepted. The Romans boarded the ship, finding both Macedonian and Carthaginian diplomats, as well as documents that showed Hannibal and Philip were negotiating an alliance. From those on board, the Romans learned that this was just one of many diplomatic missions between Hannibal and Philip. Marcus Valerius Lavinus was put in charge of Roman forces in Apulia to contain the Macedonian threat. Meanwhile, Marcellus was overwhelmingly voted as one of the consuls for the year 215, thanks to his action at Nola. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, another capable commander, was chosen as his colleague. However, the Senate disapproved of having 2 plebeian consuls, and they forced Marcellus to step aside in favor of Fabius Maximus, retaining the title of proconsul instead. With manpower depleted in some communities of Italy due to losses against Hannibal, Rome reverted to the Fabian strategy of avoiding conflict with the Carthaginian general. Many towns were hastily fortified, and the Roman Senate decreed that the crops be brought to walled cities to increase food stockpiles and deprive Hannibal of provisions that he could loot. Farmers who failed to comply faced confiscation of land and property, as well as immediate imprisonment and forced labor in the mines. Unable to dislodge Hannibal and unwilling to meet him in battle, the Roman strategy was to contain him. With around 40,000 men at his disposal at Capua and another 20,000 under Hanno in Bruttium, Hannibal faced 100,000 Roman troops in southern Italy. In spring, Hannibal marched out of Capua, establishing his camp on Mount Tifata. This was a strong defensive position from where he was at hand to support his Italian allies and oppose the Roman generals in the area. The imposing mountains could be easily found by reinforcements and supplies coming from his Italian allies and Carthage. Across the Mediterranean, Hasdrubal completed the muster of his forces at New Carthage and moved north once more towards the Ebro. Knowing that an arduous journey lay ahead, he made sure to levy enough funds to secure safe passage, purchase additional provisions, and hire Gallic warriors on his way to Italy. But at the fore was the destruction of the Roman army in Iberia. The Scipio brothers were aware of Hasdrubal's plan. Word of his decrees and preparations had reached them. They understood well what is at stake. If Hasdrubal were to link up with Hannibal in Italy, that would spell the end of Rome. But Undefeated since disembarking in Iberia nearly 3 years ago, the Scipios enjoyed confidence of their troops and could count on the fighting spirit of their heavy infantry. They marched out of the camp and crossed the Ebro at Amposta, a town that defected to the Romans, then proceeded to attack Carthaginian allies. Moving upstream, a small detachment stayed on the northern side of the river, while Gnaeus led the main body of the army along the southern bank. Publius commanded the fleet up the river to support operations on land. Their main target was the city of Hibera, the wealthiest city in the region. Strategically placed, it held a vital river crossing, and from its fluvial port it controlled the traffic of the lower Ebro. The taking of Hibera and the scorching of the surrounding towns and countryside would significantly delay the enemy's projected march. But then, Hasdrubal's army appeared earlier than expected. Confident that Hibera can hold out behind its fortifications, he did not speed to the relief of his ally. Instead, he marched on Amposta. Situated at the mouth of the Ebro, the town was larger than other settlements in the vicinity and housed important grain silos. Its defenses, however, could not hold out as long as Hibera's. If Amposta were to fall, the Roman army and fleet would not be able to prevent the reduction of their main camp. Worse, Hasdrubal would be able to cross the Ebro uncontested and position his army between the Romans and Tarraco, cutting their supply lines. For the Carthaginians, their objective was clear. To continue their march to Italy, they had to overrun Roman positions north of the Ebro. They needed a battle of annihilation. Thus, Hasdrubal clearly wanted to lure the Romans into a decisive encounter, and he succeeded. The Scipio brothers aborted the siege of Hibera and set out for Amposta. Besides aforementioned problems that the Romans might face, not challenging Hasdrubal would also hurt their prestige. Leaving a Roman ally to their fate would shake the loyalty of other communities. The Scipios had to act. On a plain just south of the Ebro River, the two armies deployed for a set-piece battle. The Romans deployed in their traditional formation, with velites in the front, 3 lines of infantry, flanked by the Italian allies and Iberian auxiliaries, who were in turn flanked by the cavalry. Hasdrubal placed the Iberian and Ligurian mercenary infantry in the center, flanked by the Punic and Libyan heavy infantry. Numidian light and contingents of Maori cavalry occupied the right wing, while the Iberian and Libyan Punic cavalry were on the left, with elephants behind both wings. Being on the south side of the Ebro, Gnaeus had to advance. As long as the Carthaginians were present, it would have been very dangerous to attempt a river crossing, even with the aid of the Roman fleet. When the battle was joined, Hasdrubal pulled back the Iberian infantry. The Numidians and Maori harassed the Italian cavalry opposing them, causing chaos among their ranks. On the left wing, the Iberian and Libyan Punic horse proved superior to the Roman cavalry. Then, as planned, the Libyan and Punic heavy infantry struck the flanks of the Roman center. Like his older brother at Cannae had done the year prior, Hasdrubal wanted to hold the Roman center until his cavalry swept the field of Roman mounted units, before regrouping to attack the enemy's rear to complete the envelopment. But, not keen on embarking on a journey to Italy far from their homes, the Iberian troops were in poor spirits. In stark contrast, the Romans knew that their return home depended on the outcome of the battle. They were ready to win or die. It wasn't long before the Iberians in the center lost heart. They broke and fled in the face of the advancing Roman infantry. Hasdrubal's plan fell apart. With his cavalry still engaged, only the Libyan and Punic infantry were now facing the Roman legions, and they were quickly pushed back. Seeing that the line collapsed, the Carthaginian cavalry wheeled about and retreated. Hasdrubal also escaped, crucially managing to take the treasury with him. Locked in bitter fighting, most of the Libyan and Punic heavy infantry, the best and most loyal troops, perished, while the rest of the army marched away to safety. Despite their victory, the Scipios did not follow up with a campaign of their own. Their finances were critical, and there was little prospect of reinforcements from Rome, due to heavy losses suffered in Italy. As experienced generals, the brothers knew that their position was precarious against the vast resources of Carthaginian Iberia. They could not risk their army in major encounters for the time being. But their victory pushed the Carthaginians out of the Ebro Valley. The wealthy city of Hibera surrendered to Rome, and with that came the usual hostage-taking, punitive payments, and the obligation to provide auxiliary troops. The submission of Hibera meant that other important fortified Iberian towns in Illa Cavona, such as Intibili and Ildum, also surrendered to the Scipios. Now, the Romans could use the length of the Ebro to move troops and supplies, launch small-scale raids to destabilize Carthaginian rule in the area, and apply pressure on the tribes that lived along the river to join Rome. But most crucially, the Scipios had not only prevented their own expulsion from Iberia, but also the doubling of Carthaginian forces in Italy, something which Rome would not have withstood. The impact of the Battle of Hibera would be far-reaching.